I wanted to take a moment to thank you for coming back to History Happens. If this is your first time here, this is what happens here. I pick random and very bizarre chapters of history to dig a little deeper into and pull out the details to be able to share them with you. Today is something that I have chosen from the medieval era, so 1500s. And it's kind of dark. It's something that happened in Sweden. We don't get a lot of dark history from Sweden, so this one's fun for me to dig into. And I just wanted to say that I know that there's been a lot of people that have been listening and watching these episodes, and I really appreciate you, and I do appreciate the feedback. Some people have talked about you really need a better camera, you need a better microphone, and the announcement today is that I have both of those things on the way. Thanks to the people that have been just watching and liking and interacting and commenting on the videos, I've been able to justify that purchase. So I have a new camera on the way. It'll be here on Thursday. It is now Monday, so I'm a couple of days away still from being able to record my first videos with that new camera, and the microphone will be here on Friday. So be prepared. It's going to get better. So now on to the episode. This one is really interesting, and I do hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed researching this one. So there are these moments in history where power doesn't just fall or fail. It fractures in a way that absolutely leaves people, everyone nearby, completely exposed to sharp edges, like holding a broken glass. On May 24th of 1567, inside the stone corridors of Uppsala Castle in Sweden, a king walked into a prison corridor, into a cell. He was not walking in as a ruler necessarily delivering justice, but he was a man who was unraveling under the weight of suspicion and fear and isolation. The men inside the castle were not just common criminals. These people in the cell were nobles. They were powerful people, members of a family who had shaped Sweden for generations. And on that day, they were waiting, not really sure whether their king was going to show mercy or end them. But to understand how this moment came to exist, you have to step back into the mind of King Erik XIV. He was not always just this figure of complete instability. He was educated, ambitious. He was deeply aware of the fragile nature of power. It comes and goes. Sweden, in the mid-1600s, was a nation under pressure. War, strained resources, and rival powers watched them closely and internally. The aristocracy held immense influence. Erik did not trust that influence. In fact, he feared it. He began to see the nobility not as partners in governance, but as potential enemies who might take his throne if they were given the chance to do so. And he didn't want to give them a chance. And at the center of that fear stood the Sture family. They were respected, influential, and deeply embedded in the Swedish political structure. Among them was Nils Sture. He was a man who had already endured humiliation at the king's command. At one point, he'd been paraded through Stockholm in a degrading display wearing a straw crown, which was a symbol that was meant to strip him of any dignity. That alone would have been enough to create tension. But Erik's fear went deeper and further than this. He became absolutely convinced that the Stures were plotting against him despite a lack of any kind of clear evidence. And then there was something even more unsettling that really shaped Erik's thinking. He believed in prophecy. Specifically, he fixated on a prediction that a light-haired man was going to succeed him. But instead of dismissing this as superstition, he allowed it to guide his suspicions. In his mind, this was not just politics anymore. This was fate closing in on him. And when a king begins to interpret ordinary events through the lens of destiny and threat, every conversation becomes suspicious. Every gathering feels like conspiracy, and every noble begins to look like your rival. By May of 1567, the tensions had reached a breaking point. Several nobles, including members of the Sture family, were invited to what seemed like a political gathering, But instead, these people were arrested. Talk about your bait and switch. They were taken to Sture Castle. I know I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. Svartsjo. And I do have this written down in front of me. And just know that I do have dyslexia. So sometimes I transpose the letters. So I think I may have put the T in the beginning of the word instead of toward the end. Whatever. Anyway, Svartsjo. That sounds like I'm saying they farted on Joe. I don't know. Anyway, they were taken to this castle and questioned and accused and then transferred to Uppsala Castle. For those who are familiar with the word Uppsala or the place of Uppsala, this was mentioned in the TV show Vikings. That might be why it's familiar to you. But Vikings has its own historical issues. Anyway, the charges against these people were quite serious. They were conspiracy, treason, betrayal. But of course, the evidence was, like I said, thin. They often extracted under pressure or built on rumor from other people. So there's nothing that says that any of this was even true at all, but they wanted it to be true. So they tortured people until they told them that this is what was true. Still, they were held and they were waiting for a final decision that would determine their fate from the king, who was suspicious of them and probably torturing people to be able to get this evidence and information in the first place. Well, outside of those prison walls, these people's families were pleading for mercy. Among them was a lady named Martha Lejonhufvud, the wife of Sture, and she was a mother of two of the other imprisoned men. She appealed to Karen Mansdotter, a woman close to the king, hoping that through her, some kind of reason might be able to reach him. So for a brief moment, it seemed like maybe they had, and there was some hope. And on the morning of May 24th, Karen told Martha, now we're getting into the Karen told Martha phone conversations here. Karen told Martha that the king had promised not to harm the prisoners. Yeah, I know there's not phones back then, whatever. So imagine that moment anyway. So Karen tells Martha that the king promised not to harm them. So Martha, she's the mother of two of these men. This has got to be a lot of stress for her. Imagine her relief. I mean, she's fragile and cautious still, but this is a promise from the king. And this meant everything to her. This was her family in there. And then something happened that no one in the castle could have predicted with any kind of certainty. But perhaps in hindsight, it seems tragically inevitable. This same exact day that King Erik entered one of the prison cells, he approached Sture, fell to his knees, and begged for forgiveness. He admitted that he had wronged this man. He promised reconciliation. A king dropped to his knees and started begging for reconciliation and forgiveness. It was a scene that must have felt really surreal. The king humbling himself before a man he had accused of treason. And I'm sure that for a moment, this looked like any kind of sense of crisis had completely passed. But the moment didn't last. Hours later, Erik returned. This time, something had shifted. The man who had asked for forgiveness was gone. He was replaced by someone overtaken by panic and instability. He drew a dagger and attacked Nils. That single act shattered any remaining illusion of any sense of safety these people had. What followed was not a trial or a sentence, but an order. The guards were commanded to kill the other prisoners, and they obeyed. Sture was killed. Nils was killed. Erik Sture was killed. Abraham Stenbock and Ivar Ivarsson were all killed. The violence spread quickly through the confined space of the castle. There was confusion even in the execution of the order. Two men named Sten were present, and the guards were unsure which one the king had meant to spare because he had said to spare one of them, but which one? And because of that uncertainty, both of them survived. It wasn't mercy that saved them. It was hesitation. Then came another moment that reveals just how far things had descended. The king's former tutor, Dionysius Beresus, attempted to calm him down. This was a man who had once guided Erik, someone who might have reached him when others could not. And instead, he was killed too. At that point, the violence had consumed not just the perceived enemies, but anyone who stood in his path. The man had gone completely off his rocker. After these killings, the castle was completely locked down. And in one of the most chilling details of this entire event, the guards continued to accept food from the families of the victims as if nothing had happened, without telling them that their families were dead. And those outside of the walls still believed their loved ones were still alive, of course. Inside, the truth was already sealed all over the walls. Erik himself, the king, fled. He left the castle and wandered into the surrounding countryside. Days later, he was found dressed as a peasant, his mind completely in disarray. The king who had commanded armies and ruled a nation was now a man lost in his own thoughts, detached from realities that he himself had created. The aftermath of the Sture murders sent shockwaves through all of Sweden. The aristocracy was, of course, rightfully horrified. Trust in the crown was shattered. Even those close to Erik could no longer ignore what had happened. Eventually, his own family moved against him. His brothers led an uprising, and within a short time, Erik XIV was completely deposed from the crown. The man who had feared losing his throne had, through his own actions, ensured that he would lose the crown. In the years that followed, the Sture murders were remembered not as an act of justice, but as warning. A warning about what happens when fear takes hold of power, when suspicion replaces evidence, and when rulers become isolated from the voices that might have grounded them. Erik did not begin his reign as this monster, this bloodthirsty beast. He became one through a combination of pressure and paranoia and unchecked authority. History often asks us to look at these moments like this and decide what matters most. Was Erik a victim in his own mind, or was he a ruler who allowed his fear to justify what was inevitably unforgivable? Was this a failure of one man, or was this a failure of a system that allowed no one to stop him? So here's the question I want to leave you with to think about and answer in the comments. At what point does fear stop being understandable and start becoming dangerous when it's held by someone in power? And as always, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Remember that every subscriber does help, and I do always appreciate every subscriber and every comment. Thank you for watching.